Is it legal when if there are survivors clinging to whatever, is it legal to then strike them again? And maybe we don't know the full answer to that question, but that is the central issue here.
Can I just?
That's the central issue.
The question is not actually that. The question is
the question is actually
Abby,
that.
because the whole thing hangs on whether the boat is still a military target or not.
The issue when it comes
was a military
to
target.
the
There were people
legality
on it when they hit it the
strike,
first time.
the issue when it comes to the legality of the second strike, not the first one.
It's not whether there are people there.
It is
whether it's still a legitimate target.
No. It's what happens to survivors.
In today's video, Abby Phillip destroys Batya Ungar-Sargon on Newsnight with Abby Phillip. The debate erupts fast as Abby Phillip presses Batya Ungar-Sargon on the September 2nd airstrike and the growing accusations of a possible war crime, while Batya Ungar-Sargon tries to spin the conversation towards politics and media framing. Abby Phillip keeps snapping the debate back to facts, leadership failures, shifting Pentagon stories, and whether the strike was even legal once the target was already disabled. It's sharp, tense, and packed with real accountability. So let's dive in and watch how Abby Phillip shuts down Batya Ungar-Sargon on Newsnight with Abby Phillip.
There's a lot of deflection going on there, just his body language as he talks about this. And then he uses the term fog of war as if that absolves you from responsibility, does it?
No, listen, it is September 2nd. This is the opening strike on a highly controversial air campaign that has never really been done before by the American military. And you have the Secretary of Defense saying that he didn't stick around for the whole strike. He had a meeting to go to, and he couldn't see the entire thing through. You were the Secretary of Defense. You can push the meeting, and you can stay for the strike, because lo and behold, conveniently, at the very moment that he walks out, apparently a war crime occurs. So everything that he just said there in those clips is fascinating. First of all, any, I guess, defense or other narrative that this boat was still operable is gone, because Secretary Hegseth just said it was on fire. And you have the President of the United States saying something that you would expect the President of the United States to say, which is that he's relying on his Secretary of Defense for this information. Well, guess what? Pete Hegseth doesn't have that information for you, because he walked out of the room. And now there's a 4-star general with a highly respectable career in the special operations community who's going to be left holding the bag.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like they really are throwing him under the bus. Let me just read what George Will, a conservative columnist, said about this whole thing. He says, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth seems to be a war criminal without a war, an interesting achievement. The killing of the survivors by this moral slum of an administration should nauseate Americans. A nation incapable of shame is dangerous, not least to itself. I would have expected, despite there's all this back and forth about who ordered it, who didn't, let's put all that aside. They're in that room. They're asked about it. We know there's a second strike. Why didn't either one of those men say, we're going to look into this, something like that should never happen in an engagement by the United States military? Why?
Abby, I can't even understand any of this Venezuela thing. To me, it is absolutely cuckoo crazy. Look, Nicolás Maduro and Hugo Chavez before him are corrupt, sadistic, cruel, thieves, authoritarian, anti-American son of a bitch. And what Donald Trump is doing is attempting regime change. I will be incredibly happy, elated, if Nicolás Maduro goes away, I don't care which way. But the things that Donald Trump is claiming regarding Venezuela, that they are flooding the U.S. with drugs, that simply is not true. The fentanyl that is killing all of these Americans is coming through Mexico. The the preferred route for drug dealers is through the Pacific and then through Central America, including the country of Honduras, where he just pardoned the former president that did flood American streets with cocaine that killed thousands and thousands of Americans.
What really stands out in this conversation is how both Abby Phillip and Ana Navarro are tapping into concerns that go way beyond this single strike or this single administration. Abby Phillip's frustration about accountability lands because history shows that when top officials distance themselves from controversial operations, it often leaves lower-ranking officers absorbing the fallout. We've seen this pattern before, from the Abu Ghraib scandal to the botched Kabul drone strike, where the chain of command gets blurry the moment something goes wrong. Abby's point about leadership responsibility isn't just commentary, it's rooted in long-established norms about civilian oversight and military transparency. At the same time, Ana Navarro brings crucial context about Venezuela that's often missing in these discussions. She's right to highlight that the US narratives about regional threats have repeatedly been shaped by political agendas, not clean intelligence. For decades, administrations from both parties have justified interventions in Latin America by overstating or strategically framing security risks. And Ana is absolutely correct that the fentanyl pipeline isn't tied to Venezuela. The DEA's own reports show that fentanyl precursors are manufactured in China, processed by Mexican cartels, and smuggled largely through legal US ports of entry. Her perspective adds necessary grounding in the real data. Together, Abby and Ana are basically underscoring two sides of the same problem: shaky leadership at the top and shaky narratives driving foreign policy. One focuses on process, the other on truth. And honestly, both angles are essential if anyone wants to understand how we ended up in this mess in the first place.
And then, he's claiming that Venezuela opened up prisons and insane asylums and released all these people into the United States. That actually did happen. It happened in 1980 in Cuba, and we all saw it happen. I was in Miami when the Mariel boat lift happened. There is zero evidence that that has happened in Venezuela. What happens? He wants to do regime change. He wants his Panama with Noriega. He wants his Grenada moment like Ronald Reagan did. But he can't say that it's regime change. One, because it's highly unpopular with the American people. And because, two, it would require the authorization of Congress.
Well, and we're not even close operationally, right? We're not even on land yet. And we've already got a war crime, national embarrassment on our hands. We haven't even proceeded with the actual land operation.
And how much of the U.S. Navy arsenal is off the coast of Venezuela right now?
Absolutely. For some kilos of cocaine?
Well,
give me a break. It's gotta be.
Batya, I'd raised this yesterday. I think one of the big question marks here is this a pretext for regime change? And if it is, what is our level of engagement going to be in that? And should they be transparent about it? I think those are really important questions for Americans who care. If they're on those battleships in the Caribbean, if they are living. There are many Americans in the Caribbean who could be, in the area. As Trump has said, the airspace around Venezuela is closed. So don't we deserve answers on some of those things? Even on a basic level, don't we deserve answers about who these men were? If he knew exactly what they were and what they were doing, don't we deserve answers about that?
I definitely want to know if regime change is happening, and I will be very angry if it happens and I was not informed. So the answer to all those questions, I always want more information. But I feel like we're in the midst of another Russiagate hoax. There was a group of Democrats who said you can refuse illegal orders, and now they are out there in search of a war crime, and there absolutely isn't one. So what happened was the DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel issued a classified legal opinion authorizing these U.S. military strikes. At that point, the Department of, I guess I have to call it War, issued the directive that we were going to start hitting them. At that point, Admiral Bradley gave the order for the first strike. Pete Hegseth watched it. The boat caught fire. Now, in order to establish that a war crime happened, we have to know that the boat was completely destroyed. The military action, which was authorized by the DOJ under Article 2 powers, which Trump has the legal right to issue, that boat was destroyed, was no longer a threat, and that there were two people clinging to it for life who were also no longer a threat. We do not know that yet.
What Ana Navarro is getting at here taps into a long pattern of how U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America has been shaped, not by evidence, but by political ambition. And honestly, history backs her up. Every time an administration leans on dramatic claims about criminals being sent into the US, it's almost always unsupported by intelligence. The State Department, DHS, and independent watchdogs have repeatedly found no verified operations from Venezuela resembling anything like a mass release of prisoners toward the US border. If something like that had even a hint of legitimacy, it would show up in DEA threat assessments or CBP data, and it simply doesn't. Anna's skepticism about regime change motives is also grounded in decades of precedent. US interventions in Latin America, from Guatemala in 1954 to Panama in 1989, were often justified with half-true or exaggerated threats. Every declassified document eventually showed how thin the evidence was, and when regime change is carried out without transparency, it's always the civilians, Americans and Latin Americans, who end up paying the price, not the politicians selling the narrative. That's why Anna is right to question the buildup of military assets near Venezuela. Historically, a sudden concentration of naval power in the Caribbean has almost always preceded covert or direct action, and the idea that questioning this is somehow a hoax ignores the fact that even conservative foreign policy experts warn about mission creep, especially when legal authorizations are kept classified. If anything, asking for basic transparency isn't partisan, it's responsible. Anna's push for clarity isn't hysteria, it's the bare minimum any democracy should demand.
You don't really
And
need to know
what
all
happened
I tend to disagree. I mean, we do have a JAG lawyer who has a lot of experience with military strikes.
I
think it's a really
because if the boat was only disabled and not destroyed, it is still a legitimate military target.
Hold on. Here's the main issue: is it legal when if there are survivors clinging to whatever? Is it legal to then strike them again? And maybe we don't know the full answer to that question, but that is the central issue here.
Can I just?
That's the central
issue. The question is not actually that. The question is
the question is actually
Abby,
that
the whole thing hangs on whether the boat is still a military target or not.
The issue when it comes
it was a military target,
to the legality
on it when they hit it the
strike,
first time.
the issue when it comes to the legality of the second strike, not the first one.
It's not whether there are people there.
It is
whether
what
it's
happens
still a legitimate target.
No. It's what happens to survivors.
No, it's not.
And we don't
that's
know.
Wrong.
I think I'm going to acknowledge that there are things about this that we don't know. That we don't know where they were, what was the state of the boat, all that stuff. Sure, we don't know who gave the order, but I do think that is the central question, Margaret, that needs to be answered.
The question is not the existence of the survivors; it's whether the boat is still a legitimate military target.
Margaret,
hold on a
is
second.
that not
Margaret, I want Margaret to weigh in on
That's simply
this.
not true.
Why?
Look, because you cannot shoot survivors of a shipwreck that are clinging on for dear life in the middle of the ocean.
You're using the word shipwreck to hide the distinction
I'll use Secretary Hexas'
The word shipwreck is in the regs.
Yes, but I'm saying the whole point here is it still a legitimate target or not? If they can get on that debris and call for the rest of the narco-terrorists to show up and save them, it is still a legitimate military target.
Okay, I'm going to defer to the expert here. Go ahead,
factually,
Margaret.
this just doesn't pass the laugh test. You're talking about two people stranded in the middle of the ocean, and you think they're going to call for backup.
Is that distinction between whether it is disabled or whether it is destroyed?
Can we back up a little bit, because I just want to explain sort of how an airstrike is prosecuted, right? Because first you have a target in the first place, and the target could be an individual, the target could be a building, the target could be a boat.
Say something.
And so this is why we need, and we talked about this the other night, we need a full investigation. What was the target? Because I thought the target was the drugs. Those are gone if the boat's on fire. Maybe the target is the so-called terrorists.
The target was the boat, according to all of the reporting.
So I think we should wait for an investigation to see what the target actually was. If the target was a boat, then we're in this place where we are using military force to target boats. What?
Okay, you don't think that the initial military attack was legitimate.
Can I make one more point? Because this entire hypothetical,
it's not even about the second one,
entire hypothetical that you're posing hinges on whether or not they could call somebody to be rescued. But if they're in a scenario where they need to call somebody to be rescued, they are shipwrecked. That is the definition of shipwrecked, and they cannot be targeted.
What Abby Phillip and Margaret Donovan are pushing for here isn't emotional outrage, it's basic adherence to international law and how modern militaries operate. The Geneva Conventions and long-established rules of armed conflict are really clear on one point. Once combatants are incapacitated, shipwrecked, or otherwise hors de combat, they cannot be legally targeted. That's not a fringe interpretation. It's the foundation of maritime warfare law going back to the Hague Conventions of 1907. Even the US Naval War College teaches that survivors in open water are to be treated as protected persons unless they actively re-engage in hostilities, something that is practically impossible for two people floating on debris miles out at sea. And Abby and Margaret are also right to focus on the distinction between a legitimate military target and what happens after that target is neutralized. US targeting protocol requires positive identification, continued threat assessment, and proportionality. Once a vessel is burning, immobile, and its cargo destroyed, the threshold for making a second strike skyrockets. That's why every reputable military legal expert, JAG academia, former commanders, keeps emphasizing that investigations exist precisely to determine whether that line was crossed. The idea that two stranded individuals could somehow summon reinforcements in the middle of open ocean also just doesn't square with operational realities. Communications equipment is usually disabled in explosions, saltwater ruins electronics instantly, and cartel or militia boats don't magically materialize on command. So Abby and Margaret's insistence on clarity and investigation is not only reasonable, it's aligned with how lawful military operations are actually supposed to work. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.